Yakuza 4 is the first game in the series to introduce multiple playable protagonists, and took huge strides with its story to really flesh out this particular fictional world and the Yakuza and the surrounding organizations attached to it. The game's ambitious nature certainly wasn't expected and really pushed the series' reputation forward, as the team behind the game, RGG, managed to forge themselves an additional aspect to their reputation as a studio willing to take risks and change things up, all in the name of quality and making some good ass titles. It's certainly an ambitious game in many respects for 2010 when it came out, which is kind of crazy in retrospect, as this is a period where RGG studios were working as hard as they could to make the most of the new PS3 era. 2008 you had Kenzan, 2009 Yakuza 3 saw the mainline franchise arrive on the new console thanks to the viability proven by Kenzan. 2010 was this, Yakuza 4, and its ambitious new elements flexing the studio's strength. 2011 really came out of left field with Dead Souls introducing zombies, but the gunplay was really the most bizarre addition to the franchise at that point. Then you realize that there was just no slowing down RGG, because it turns out behind the scenes they were gearing up for 2 games to come out in 2012. One of their most ambitious, jam-packed and quality entries into the Yakuza franchise in Yakuza 5, and a game totally unexpected and more geared toward a Western audience in Binary Domain. That was totally different. A third-person action-adventure shooter with some buddy mechanics set in a futuristic Neo-Tokyo with similar commentary on unjust power structures found in the Yakuza series, albeit from a more different approach. It got some mixed reviews that probably scared off RGG from really branching out again, at least for a little while. So this was a manic time around the offices, and Yakuza 4 was smack dab in the middle of all that craziness. I think the confidence they must have had at the time really went into overdrive when making 4. Not only were new protagonists created, the story wasn't held back either. Yakuza 3, which, well, not totally isolated from the franchise overarching series narrative, is still relatively a self-contained plot, and compared to that, Yakuza 4 is almost in a league of its own. The story draws inspiration from previous games in such clever ways, masterfully reconnects plot elements from the series to its own events, and gives characters from before some real weight to their backstories, while simultaneously managing to slot new characters into the overarching series so well you'll generally have a hard time even remembering when they weren't in there for the first 3 games. While they kept the well-known, liked and respected core mechanics of the franchise in Yakuza 4, they weren't afraid to branch out and expand on what players had previously known. This was adopted into their methods moving forward, and that really shows, especially with Yakuza 5. Their PS3 endeavors came to a close on a high note, and Yakuza 4 was a really strong signal point for the success. Anyway, games after that period, while released on the PS3 as well, were more targeted so at the PS4's improved hardware and technology, and included Inshin, Yakuza 0 and Yakuza Kiwami. The main point here being to recognize just how much of a crunch it must have been to work on these games during the real formative years of the studio, and how much talent is shown here by just how good these games turned out, and how they continued to one-up one another in at least one aspect or the other, eventually culminating in a game that would see the series really skyrocketing the games to its so well-deserved Western success in Yakuza 0, which ironically came 2 years later after its Japanese release, and so it was stuck behind in an older era. See, the new era had already begun, represented by the new Dragon engine for the next generation of consoles, and had already had its representative Yakuza game in Yakuza 6, which was also the game in which Kiryu's mainline story would come to an end, and a new cast of characters could now take this extremely popular now franchise forward. I think the main aspect that impressed me the most is just how easy the characters was to get into. Character-wise, these guys had to be something special. 3 games down with Kiryu and all the adventures we had gone on together, and yet I do not start with him. There better be something really good here to justify this. What's crazy is that after 10 minutes of playtime, I totally forgot that sentiment and was just having a great time. While I did immediately take a liking to Akiyama, the first character you play as, and his suave yet lazy attitude, I think the real victory here is brilliantly easing the player into his combat. Akiyama is by far the easiest character to learn how to play, thanks to the swiftness of his attacks and dodges, and his relative ease in understanding his combos. He just feels right to play, no doubt thanks to his unique yet super easy to pick up fighting style that's 99% kicks combined with carefully programmed tutorial NPCs, as well as a good flow and pacing of his first chapter. As you progress through the game, you realize Akiyama is supposed to at least represent a character to take over Kiryu's mantle of the main man in the series. The parallels in the story beats allude to this with how interconnected Akiyama is to the Yakuza, Tojo clan, and even Kamurocho itself. The main man of Kamurocho is and still remains Kiryu though, the rest of the series, but it is obvious just how reluctantly Kiryu possesses this title. Akiyama, on the other hand, while certainly not looking for this title, is a beacon to so many in the city, while owning the top club in the biggest industry the city itself basically built itself on. On top of that, the man seems to possess endless amounts of money and powerful connections to the top brass of both sides of the law. The only other character this manages to parallel is Kiryu himself. In combat, he becomes most similar to Kiryu. His ease of play fully upgraded, as well as his faux all-around nature of just being as comfortable in crowds as in one-on-ones lends a familiar feeling to his style of combat. But where we can really see it is in his progression. Throughout the final chapters of the story, we can see Akiyama start to embody some of the traits Kiryu passes on to him, but in-game is where we can really feel this take place. The Swift Phoenix learns his counter kick and sliding reversal, which are just versions of the fan favorites and very powerful moves of the Tiger Drop and Knockdown Reversal possessed by Kiryu throughout most of the series. He also is the only character that can hope to match the speed at which Kiryu can deliver his deadly attacks. Akiyama's sub-story is also very telling, as they really do a lot of the legwork in rounding out his character. In fact, Akiyama has the most chained set of follow-on sub-stories in this game, most relating to his two businesses he maintains around the city. Through these, we can really develop an appreciation for what Akiyama appreciates in a person, which plays a role in the main story as well. Hard work in tough times, idealism in the good times, and an openness to people regardless of initial standing or status is what Akiyama represents and appreciates in a person who steps into his life. However, mostly what we are able to do is peel back the facade he presents most of the world to see the idealistic yet cynical Boy Scout sleazy businessman beneath it all. Saejima, in contrast to the other characters, is hard to pick up initially, but this makes perfect sense given the jail setting, lore, and character breakdown we receive upon initial introductions. It can be a nightmare of tedium and tough fights to force your way out of prison. Not since my first foray into the series in Kiwami have I had this much trouble in one of these games. Once you are out, you are rewarded with possibly the biggest fan service so far, and the knowledge that instantly makes Saejima one of the most important characters, not only in game but also across the series. During Saejima's part is where the story really starts to kick into gear, as almost all the major players as well as past and present events are linked to a dramatic day in 1985 involving the highest conspiracy we see with the Tojo clan in the entire series. While the events in the first games are of incredibly high stakes, the effects Saejima and his oath brother Majima's plan are equally as high and reverberate throughout the series in a way more dramatic and impactful fashion, especially considering its connection to Majima and the rest of the series moving forward. Also, beyond that, every single action he takes in the main story has the most significant effects and does the heavy lifting in terms of moving the story to its more dramatic moments. Basically, if an important event takes place, you know by the end of the game it's deeply connected to the past and present actions of this man. Saejima is very big and very strong, like one of the many trucks that come bursting through the scenes in these games. As such, his combat when fully upgraded can be some of the most devastating and powerful in the game. Enemies of any size are no match for the type of claws Saejima can present, while simultaneously being able to tank many other attacks. A tank, essentially, Saejima is heavily reliant on his strength rather than his speed, and while this is a great way to brute force your way through some crowds, standing one-on-one against an opponent more keen on using their speed and Saejima may feel cumbersome to play. However, if you are good enough at anticipating their attacks, then they're usually nimble for the sake of speed bodies are easily dealt with. Saejima is a big guy with a narrow focus on achieving what he believes is right. It would have been so easy to fall into the stereotype of big guy who is overly lovable but a misunderstood oaf because of his scary demeanor, or the brute force ideologue who only bashes his way to victory. However, the writing staff managed to craft something different and unique while still managing to maintain Saejima's imposing demeanor. Saejima in the story is a strong-willed character with certain strict beliefs on what makes the Yakuza strong in such a way that although uncompromised mesmerizing, is more accepting, perceptive, and ultimately convincing to much younger and more contemporary characters. Yet somehow Saejima still manages to hold on to beliefs that are based on the rough and tumble times of the 80s, ideals that are quickly fading away from the modern day organization. It is quite a complicated thing to experience, and the writing somehow manages to show its integration in such a smooth and naturalistic way that so easily slots in with what has been brought to the table already, and shows just how the strength and good of these old ideals can be integrated further. As such, Saejima quickly becomes one of the most interesting characters in the story. However, in the sub-stories, he is mostly reduced to a big oaf in a fish out of water situation that uses his strength to bash his way through to the solution, or a big and scary at first protector of children that uses that contrasted with kindness to hammer home a good message to said impressionable kid. It's disappointing to see just how much stereotypes of a big strong guy come into play here. His sub-stories are just filled with cliched characterizations that really most of the time do not match his character writing in the story or subsequent games. Also, the fish out of water aspect is done brilliantly in the story already, having Saejima being the only character that is somewhat restricted in Kamurocho and is forced to use the new extensions introduced into the game. In the sub-stories, however, it is played up into such a ridiculous degree and from such a different and unoriginal angle that most of them feel rushed. It feels like this is the price we have to pay for receiving one of the most interesting and well-rounded characters we have in the series. Tanimura is one of my favorite characters, and to really show why, I think we should start with discussing his sub-stories. When sitting down to write the script, I felt confused that I couldn't remember any of Tanimura's sub-stories, that I put them to the side in favor of the excellent story of his master's training. I generally thought I had. Turns out, what I thought was part of his story was actually his sub-stories. Saving the owner of the restaurant he uses as a hideout from a kidnapping, helping the little foreign kids from Little Asia out by giving them a sense of place and purpose, and helping out the general community as a police officer were actually all sub-stories. The quality in writing for Tanimura's sub-stories and the actual story part is almost indistinguishable. While this is achieved in some sub-stories through the franchise, it is most frequent here in Tanimura's part. I guess it makes sense given the creative liberties generally taken with the sub-stories in the general series in order to fit more of a wacky sub-stories that the series has become somewhat known for. But for whatever reason here, the quality of writing remains consistent when playing as a friendly, morally questionable, but ultimately golden-hearted pretty boy raised in the heart of the foreign residency of Kamurocho. It is stunning to see that all aspects of writing remain consistent, from the story portion to the sub-stories to the previously mentioned master's training storyline, and even events that pop up on your police scanner, although those can get repetitive. This is the least deviation seen across multiple aspects of a character section of any of the games. The stories told here are grounded, heartfelt, and honestly some of the most real I've encountered in the series. It probably doesn't make for the most dramatic or bombastic spectacle, but it has heart, and it's a shame some of players who don't chase all the sub-stories may not get to experience them, especially how Tanimura looks into the further exploits of his biological dad on the police force. Combat time. Tanimura has a very technical moveset. So much is offered up to him from the start that makes him so different and more unique than the main characters so far. First up is his parry. Instead of just throwing up his guard, Tanimura has a brief window at the beginning of his guard that will allow him to parry most attacks and send the enemies behind him, opening them up and leaving them quite vulnerable. Secondly, his grab has two stages to it. The standard first with the chest grab, and then a second stage in which he locks his opponent's arms behind them while forcing them to hunch over. From there, he can tug on their arm to do more damage or twist them around to introduce them to his swinging foot. Those are his special unique moves, but his more standard moves are very technical in nature and rely on momentum of his attacks rather than speed or raw power. His standard 1-2 hit and finishing blow is a good example of this. A standard punch and then a quick spin into a backhand. You'll find these kinds of touches a lot while fighting as Tanimura, and it's great in that it really forces you into techniques beyond the button mashing that new players tend to hide behind. I will say, learning to play Tanimura in Yakuza 4 taught me the depths of the fighting systems present in these games. It wasn't like I was button mashing my way through everything, or that my techniques wasn't working while I was playing as him. It is the fact that I had so much fun reveling in his fighting style, so I wanted more, and that led me to discover the hidden moves lurking beneath, and unlocked my understanding of the depth of the combat system of these games. And from there, a whole new world of movesets, combos, countering, guarding, positioning, heat move, deliberation, and weapon usage emerged. Using all moves in your arsenal and knowing which moves are best comboed with each other are keys in mastering Tanimura. Surprisingly, he has some of the best moves in the game, and many of his shared moves are those found at the top level. Skills including charge up heat, the drop kick, gaining health while standing still, rolling quick step, and the leg sweep while getting back up. He also possesses some seriously impressive moves, like all those that come from his revelations, his leg arm lock while enemy is getting up, and one of the most technically impressive, his heat move that changes depending on how many hits in your rush combo you manage to land before a finishing blow. Overall, the most technical fighter in the series, which I had the most fun with, that also had some of the most honest and consistent storytelling, and ultimately made me appreciate just how much these games have to them. Tanimura and playing as him might be some of my best experiences in these games. Oh yeah, and then there's Kiryu. Kiryu at this point in the franchise has been established as the absolute demon, and as a figure surrounded by great myths and legend. At this point, he has managed to help his family to the top of the Tojo clan, tussled with and defeated the almighty dragon of the other side, effectively barring the Omi alliance from the top spot of the Yakuza world in Japan, and has managed to stop an international conspiracy involving the American weapon traffickers, Chinese mafias, and ministers within the Japanese government. Even before all that, he managed to effectively stop said Chinese mafia, claim and immediately pass on the mantle of Tojo clan chairman, and help slot Daigo into the role effectively enough. It is probably of no surprise then that we are not introduced to Kiryu neatly after finishing up with Tanimura, but rather halfway through Saejima's ordeal. The game doesn't bother with much of a real introduction either. It's Kiryu, you've heard of him one way or the other, or if you are playing for, the fourth game in the franchise, if not, you'll definitely find out whichever way you continue in the series. You face him down as Saejima, and man is he tough already. The game has no qualms facing you up against the man at the top. He uses moves you would have used to demolish the legends of past conflicts, and he pulls no punches either. This carries nicely onto his combat when you eventually get back to him. Kiryu already has way more moves unlocked from the get-go compared to everyone else. He's already on their level, and as you progress, you start to far outpace everyone you've played as so far. You have this all-around moveset that can match speed, strength, and technique that other protagonists specialize in. In fact, training once again with Kamaki will net you some, very useful, buffs. But buffs alone, no new techniques really. Not that you'll need any more, as all the iconic moves, including the Tiger Drop and the Dragon King Essence, make their return. This bleeds in with how the story treats Kiryu as a vessel for the new characters, particularly Saejima, to shine. Akiyama's arcs are strong and mostly held up by his own actions rather than others, but Saejima is a character that changes the most, goes through the most, and is ultimately more important to the overall continuation of the lore of the series. No wonder then that Kiryu is basically involved mostly with characters, events, and encounters relating to what Saejima has done so far. Kiryu, for the only time in the series, is a real side character here, and that allows for a certain level of freedom. Plot points, character motivations, connections to locations, and locals don't have to be set up. Instead, it's a simple pick up and play when it comes to Kiryu's part. You've basically learned all the concepts by playing the other characters anyway. Kiryu doesn't need much character development, although he does get some in Okinawa, and Kamurocho and those who embody it are already familiar with the Dragon of Dojima. Thus, the sub-stories are back to their zesty tone found in all other games and continue the long development of Kiryu's whole and well-rounded personality, perfectly setting up for the events of the next games in the series. Ultimately, you're back with the Dragon of Dojima, his ironclad will, and all his buddies he's made along the way to get the perfect figure to tie everything together and finish up the game in style. Yakuza 4 pushes boundaries while still retaining that familiar feeling you've come to expect from these games. I think having only Kamurocho, but this way more open version of Kamurocho, really encapsulates the sentiment. Here is a city players know like the back of their hands, yet as in every installment there are new details in store. More verticality, depth, minigames, accessible locations, methods of traversal, masters, and way to interact with the city are presented here in both familiar and fresh fashion. Yakuza 4 is a bold and memorable step up from the previous game in the series that packs so much ambition in its new mechanics while being able to smooth out the others that have worked so well prior. It would have been easy for RGD to really contrive out a simple story here, maybe introduce one more character and stick to the formula for success that more cautious studios probably would have gone for. Instead, they risked it all, putting way more ambition behind the project than they had previously, introducing new characters fully intended to be fan favorites, connecting previous storylines for a greater sense of connection, and elevating the storytelling and characterization to new, never before seen levels. They could have played it safe, but they didn't. They said, what can we do here to really shake up the formula, keep these games fresh, and show the talent we have on display? And they developed this game. What they managed to achieve proved their ambition to remain dynamic in their games. And of course, this was proven and proudly shown by Dead Souls and Binary Domain, released in the subsequent 2 years. Somehow, in that short time frame, and in the same year as Binary Domain, they managed to release a sequel to 4 that would, well, really show just how this talented team was able to set extremely high ambitions and somehow shatter them in such a short time frame. It is honestly wild to think just how good a game Yakuza 4 really is, and how it would be outclassed in just 2 years after its release. However, its legacy in introducing new characters, pushing the quality of the narrative to new heights, and setting ambitions even higher should never be forgotten, and is the reason that it will remain a hugely important and excellent fun entry into this behemoth of a franchise.
Akiyama!